Give that seat to someone who actually belongs in first class. The words rang through the quiet cabin with the kind of confidence that only came from someone who believed they would never be questioned. Several passengers stopped lifting their carry-on bags. A businessman lowered his newspaper. A young mother froze halfway into fastening her son's seat belt. Every pair of nearby eyes shifted toward seat 2A, where Naomi Brooks remained seated without the slightest sign of panic. She looked up slowly at the flight attendant standing over her, her expression calm enough to make the growing tension feel even heavier. She wore dark blue jeans, clean white sneakers, and a charcoal sweater that looked comfortable rather than expensive. There were no designer logos, no sparkling jewelry, no assistant carrying her luggage, and no signs that she belonged to the exclusive circle many people expected to see in the first-class cabin. The flight attendant, Nicole Harrison, folded her hands with practiced professionalism, although the polite smile on her face had already disappeared. "Ma'am," she said louder this time so the surrounding rows could hear every word. "That seat has been reassigned. One of our VIP guests will be boarding shortly, and we need your cooperation." Naomi glanced down at the boarding pass resting quietly in her hand before looking back at Nicole. "My boarding pass says seat 2A, she replied in an even voice. "Is there a problem with the system?" Nicole gave a short laugh that sounded more dismissive than friendly. "No, the system is fine. We simply need this seat for someone more appropriate." The final word lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. A man across the aisle slowly lowered his laptop. An elderly couple exchanged uncomfortable looks, but remained silent. Near the rear of the first-class cabin, Olivia Bennett, one of the airline's newest flight attendants, glanced toward Nicole with visible uncertainty before quickly looking away. Naomi neither raised her voice nor argued. Instead, she rested one hand lightly on the armrest and asked a simple question. "What policy allows you to remove a ticketed passenger from an assigned seat before departure?" Nicole hesitated for only a heartbeat before answering. "Company discretion." The confidence in her voice suggested she expected the conversation to end there. It didn't. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "I'd appreciate seeing that policy." Nicole's patience began to crack. "Ma'am, you're delaying boarding." Naomi looked around the cabin. "Actually, I'm sitting exactly where my boarding pass instructed me to sit." A few passengers quietly nodded, though none spoke aloud. At that moment, a sharply dressed white businessman stepped through the aircraft door carrying nothing but a leather briefcase. A gate agent greeted him by name with a broad smile before motioning toward the front of the cabin. Nicole immediately straightened her uniform and welcomed him with a warmth completely absent only seconds earlier. "Mr. Collins, thank you for your patience. We'll have your preferred seat ready in just a moment." Richard Collins barely acknowledged Naomi before looking toward seat 2A as though it already belonged to him. Nicole turned back toward Naomi, her tone colder now than before. "You heard me the first time. Please collect your things." Naomi remained perfectly still. There was no anger in her face, only quiet observation, as though every word spoken around her mattered more than anyone realized. Somewhere behind them, a phone camera quietly rose above a seat back. Olivia noticed it. So did Nicole. But neither of them noticed the small notification lighting up Naomi's phone screen, silently confirming that every second unfolding inside the cabin was already being documented exactly as intended. Naomi Brooks could have stood up. She could have accepted the inconvenience, walked toward the back of the aircraft, and disappeared into another anonymous travel story that nobody would remember by the time the plane landed. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, not because of stubbornness, but because she had learned years earlier that the smallest moments often revealed the deepest truths. She quietly placed her boarding pass on the tray table in front of her, making no attempt to hide the clearly printed seat assignment. There was nothing unusual about the ticket. It had been purchased weeks before. It had been confirmed twice. It had cleared every security checkpoint without issue. Yet somehow, after she stepped onto the aircraft, the validity of her seat suddenly depended on who was standing beside it. Richard Collins waited patiently a few feet away, adjusting the cuff of his tailored navy jacket with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never expected to hear the word no. He smiled politely at Nicole Harrison as though they had already solved the problem together. "I appreciate you taking care of this," he said. Nicole answered with an equally warm smile. We always make sure our important guests are comfortable. Naomi heard every word, but her expression never changed. Across the aisle, a woman named Emily Carter quietly watched the exchange while pretending to organize a travel magazine inside her tote bag. Something about the situation did not sit right with her. The boarding process had been smooth until this moment. Nobody else had been asked to surrender a confirmed seat. Nobody else had been questioned simply for sitting where their ticket directed them. At the front galley, Olivia Bennett opened the digital seating manifest on her company tablet. She carefully compared the information displayed on the screen with the boarding list she had reviewed less than 30 minutes earlier. Seat 2A still showed Naomi Brooks as the assigned passenger. There was no system alert, no upgrade request, no equipment change, no operational reason for a reassignment. Olivia looked toward Daniel Foster, the lead purser, hoping he would notice the same thing. Instead, Daniel gave her a subtle shake of his head before she could speak. The message was unmistakable. Stay quiet. Olivia lowered the tablet, but the uneasy feeling remained. Naomi rested both hands comfortably in her lap. Her breathing never changed. This was not the first time strangers had mistaken simplicity for weakness. 22 years earlier, she had walked into a conference room wearing an inexpensive department store suit because it was the nicest outfit she could afford after graduate school. One executive had mistaken her for administrative support before the meeting even started. She still remembered the awkward silence that followed when she delivered the opening presentation as the company's newest strategy director. Since then, she had built a career by letting assumptions collapse under the weight of facts rather than arguments. The cabin slowly filled with conversations whispered just quietly enough to avoid drawing attention. Some passengers believed Naomi should simply move to avoid delaying departure. Others wondered why a confirmed reservation suddenly seemed negotiable. Nicole stepped closer once again, her voice remaining controlled but noticeably firmer. This is your final request before we involve airport supervisors. Naomi met her eyes without hesitation. I have cooperated with every instruction that follows company policy. I am simply waiting for someone to explain why that policy suddenly changed. Daniel walked forward before Nicole could answer. We have already explained the situation, ma'am. Naomi nodded once. No, you explained a decision. You have not explained the rule behind it. Those words settled over the first-class cabin with unexpected weight. For the first time, even Richard Collins stopped looking at his watch. Somewhere near the boarding door, the gate agent received an incoming call through her headset. Her expression shifted almost immediately, and she glanced toward the aircraft with a look that suggested someone outside had just asked a question nobody inside was prepared to answer. The quiet murmur spreading through the first-class cabin grew heavier with every passing second. Boarding had nearly finished, yet nobody seemed focused on finding overhead bin space anymore. Every glance drifted back toward seat 2A, where Naomi Brooks remained composed while the crew struggled to justify a decision that sounded less convincing each time they repeated it. Daniel Foster stepped closer, straightening his jacket before speaking with the polished confidence that usually ended uncomfortable conversations. Ma'am, this is no longer a request. We are accommodating a distinguished customer whose travel status requires additional consideration. Naomi looked up calmly. Then I assume there is a written procedure supporting that decision. Daniel forced a thin smile. Not every operational decision is explained to passengers. Naomi nodded slightly. Interesting. Richard Collins cleared his throat behind them, clearly growing impatient. Can we move this along? I have a meeting in Los Angeles that cannot wait. Nicole immediately turned toward him with reassuring professionalism. We are taking care of everything, sir. Her tone softened noticeably before becoming firm again as she faced Naomi. Please collect your belongings. Naomi rested one hand lightly on her carry-on bag without lifting it. Before I move, I would simply like someone to confirm that my confirmed reservation has been legally reassigned. Daniel answered before anyone else could speak. Consider it confirmed. Olivia Bennett felt her stomach tighten. She looked down once more at the digital seating manifest glowing on her tablet. Nothing had changed. Naomi Brooks still occupied seat 2A. Richard Collins remained assigned to seat 4C, exactly where he had originally booked. Olivia quietly refreshed the screen. The information remained identical. She glanced toward Nicole, hoping she would notice the discrepancy, but Nicole refused to look at the tablet. Instead, she folded her arms, signaling that the discussion was already over. Across the aisle, Emily Carter finally lowered her magazine completely. "Excuse me," she said carefully. "If her boarding pass says seat 2A, why is she the only passenger being asked to move?" Nicole answered without hesitation. "Operational flexibility is part of every ticket agreement." Emily frowned. "I travel almost every week. I have never seen flexibility applied like this." Several nearby passengers exchanged uncertain looks. A retired Army veteran named Marcus Hill slowly removed one earbud and studied the conversation in silence. He had spent decades recognizing the difference between genuine procedure and selective enforcement. Something about this felt painfully familiar. Richard shifted his briefcase from one hand to the other. "Look, it is only one seat. Surely we do not need to create an entire scene over something so simple." Naomi finally looked directly at him. Her voice remained steady and respectful. "You are right. It is only one seat. Which makes me wonder why everyone here seems determined to take mine instead of asking why yours suddenly became more important." The cabin fell unusually quiet. Even Daniel hesitated before responding. Nicole quickly stepped forward to regain control. "Ma'am, your attitude is making this situation unnecessarily difficult." Naomi answered almost immediately. "Questions are not difficult. They only become uncomfortable when there are no honest answers." Olivia looked back at her tablet one final time. This time she noticed something she had missed before. The activity log showed no authorization code for any seat reassignment. Company policy required every first-class seating change to generate a supervisor approval number. There was none. Her eyes widened slightly. She understood exactly what that meant. Whatever decision had been made inside this cabin had never entered the airline system at all. It existed only in conversation. Daniel noticed the concern on Olivia's face and quietly mouthed two words without letting the passengers hear. "Close it." Olivia lowered the tablet, but she could not ignore what she had just discovered. At that exact moment, Naomi's phone vibrated once inside her sweater pocket. She glanced briefly at the screen before locking it again. The message contained only 5 words. "Executive monitoring has officially begun." The notification on Naomi Brooks's phone disappeared as quietly as it had arrived, but her expression never changed. She slipped the device back into her pocket as though nothing important had happened. Around her, however, the atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted. The discussion was no longer about a seat. It had become a test of who would speak when something obviously wrong unfolded in plain sight. Emily Carter slowly unbuckled her seatbelt and stood just enough to be heard without raising her voice. "I have a question," she said. "If there is an official policy, why has nobody shown it?" Nicole Harrison answered almost immediately. "Passengers are not entitled to internal operational procedures." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "That is true, but passengers are entitled to equal treatment." The sentence lingered over the first-class cabin like a weight nobody wanted to acknowledge. Marcus Hill looked from Naomi to Daniel Foster before speaking for the first time. "I spent 28 years in the Army. We followed procedures every single day. Real procedures leave records. They do not change depending on who walks through the door." Daniel forced another polite smile. "Sir, we appreciate your opinion, but this situation is under control." Marcus folded his arms. "That is exactly what people say when they stop following the rules." Richard Collins sighed impatiently. "Can everyone please stop making this into a public debate? We are delaying an entire flight." Naomi turned toward him with the same measured calm she had maintained from the beginning. No one delayed this flight by sitting in an assigned seat. Olivia Bennett felt her pulse quicken. She could still see the unchanged seating record on her tablet. Every instinct told her that remaining silent would only make the situation worse. She stepped carefully toward Daniel, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "The manifest still lists Ms. Brooks in seat 2A. There is no reassignment authorization." Daniel did not even look at the screen. "Close the tablet." Olivia hesitated. "But the records." Daniel interrupted quietly but firmly. "I said close it." She obeyed, but the knot in her stomach only grew tighter. Across the aisle, another passenger quietly lifted a phone, not to create a spectacle, but to document what was happening. Others noticed and exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody cheered. Nobody argued loudly. The silence itself had become a form of testimony. Nicole noticed the phones, and her confidence began to slip beneath the surface. She turned toward the nearest passengers. Photography is discouraged during boarding. Emily replied before anyone else could. Observing what is happening is not against the rules. Nicole looked back at Naomi. You could end this by cooperating. Naomi answered with remarkable composure. I have cooperated since I arrived at the airport. I checked in on time. I cleared security. I boarded when instructed. I sat in the seat printed on my boarding pass. If cooperation now means surrendering rights without explanation, then perhaps the definition has changed. Those words settled heavily across the cabin. Olivia looked down once more at the closed tablet in her hands. She remembered the airline orientation only 8 months earlier, when instructors repeated one sentence throughout every training session. Every passenger deserves dignity before preference. She had believed those words when she first put on the uniform. Watching this unfold, she wondered whether anyone else still did. Daniel suddenly noticed movement near the boarding door as the gate agent stepped inside the aircraft with an uneasy expression. She leaned toward him and quietly whispered something that caused the color in his face to fade for only a brief moment before he recovered his composure. He gave a short nod, dismissed her without explanation, and turned back toward the cabin as though nothing had happened. Naomi noticed every detail. She said nothing. She simply folded her hands together once again, knowing the truth had already begun moving toward the aircraft long before anyone else realized it. The tension inside the cabin no longer felt temporary. It settled over every row like heavy weather refusing to move. Nobody was talking about departure times anymore. They were watching people make choices. Daniel Foster took one deliberate step toward Naomi Brooks and spoke with the careful tone of someone trying to sound reasonable after losing control. Ma'am, airport supervisors are available if you continue refusing our instructions. Naomi looked at him calmly. I have refused nothing except an unexplained demand. Nicole Harrison exhaled sharply before reaching toward the boarding pass, resting on Naomi's tray table. She picked it up without asking and glanced at it for barely a second. This document is no longer valid for this seat, she announced. Naomi's eyes followed the movement, but she did not raise her voice. Who invalidated it? Nicole hesitated. Operational management. Naomi asked one more question. What is the authorization number? Silence answered first. Richard Collins shifted uncomfortably, looking toward the boarding door as if hoping someone else would resolve the situation. Emily Carter exchanged another glance with Marcus Hill. Neither of them spoke. They simply waited. Olivia Bennett felt every lesson from training echo through her mind. Every seating modification required documentation. Every customer interaction required transparency. Every irregularity created a record. Yet none of those safeguards seemed to exist inside this moment. Daniel quietly extended his hand toward Nicole, signaling for the boarding pass. He looked at it, then folded it once before holding it at his side. This matter has already been decided. Naomi nodded slowly. Decisions without accountability usually become problems. Those words triggered a memory she had carried for more than 2 decades. She was 23 years old, wearing a modest navy blazer she had saved 3 months to purchase before flying to her first executive leadership conference. A gate employee had smiled politely before asking whether she was looking for the economy boarding line. When Naomi explained that she held a confirmed first-class ticket earned through accumulated business travel, the employee laughed softly and asked to see the ticket twice, while other passengers walked by without a single question. She still remembered standing there with strangers quietly watching, wondering why dignity always seemed to require additional proof from people who looked like her. That morning she promised herself something simple. If success ever placed her in a position to change systems instead of surviving them, she would never ignore moments like that again. The memory faded as quickly as it had appeared. Naomi returned her attention to the cabin without the slightest trace of bitterness on her face. Please return my boarding pass, she said evenly. Daniel looked at Nicole before handing it back. Thank you, Naomi replied. She carefully placed it inside her travel wallet, then reached into her sweater pocket and removed her phone. Nobody spoke while she unlocked the screen. Richard Collins gave a quiet laugh. Calling customer service is not going to help. Naomi did not even look at him. She selected one contact and placed the phone against her ear. The call connected almost instantly. Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks, a calm voice answered. Naomi spoke only one sentence. Please initiate executive flight protocol and begin a live operational review of Flight 281. There was no anger in her voice, no dramatic threat, no attempt to impress anyone. The person on the other end responded without hesitation. Confirmed. Executive flight protocol is now active. Please remain exactly where you are. Naomi ended the call, locked her phone, and quietly returned it to her pocket. Nicole smiled with open disbelief. Do you honestly expect us to believe that changes anything? Naomi folded her hands once more and looked toward the boarding door with complete confidence. No, she said softly. I expect the next few minutes to change everything. For a few long seconds, nothing appeared to happen. The cabin remained still except for the quiet sounds of passengers settling into their seats and the distant hum of ground equipment outside the aircraft. Nicole Harrison folded her arms with renewed confidence, convinced the brief phone call had been nothing more than an empty performance. Daniel Foster checked his watch before looking toward the cockpit, clearly eager to move past the confrontation and close the aircraft door. Richard Collins smiled faintly as he adjusted his jacket once again. I told you, he said under his breath. People always make these situations bigger than they need to be. Naomi Brooks offered no response. She simply looked out the window for a moment as airport vehicles moved slowly across the ramp beneath the afternoon sun. She had spent years learning that real authority never rushed to prove itself. It simply arrived when the time was right. Near the forward galley, Olivia Bennett quietly reopened the electronic seating manifest after making certain nobody was watching. The information on the screen remained unchanged. Seat 2A still belonged to Naomi Brooks. Every required approval field remained blank. There was still no authorization for any reassignment. Olivia took a careful photograph of the display with her personal phone before locking the screen again. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of Naomi, but from the realization that someone inside the crew had abandoned the very procedures they had sworn to uphold. Emily Carter noticed Olivia's expression and quietly asked, "Is everything all right?" Olivia hesitated before answering honestly. "Something does not match our records." Emily nodded without another question. That single sentence confirmed what several passengers had already begun to suspect. Marcus Hill leaned back in his seat and quietly observed the cabin. During his military career, he had learned that discipline disappeared long before organizations admitted mistakes. It always began with people pretending obvious facts did not exist. Daniel suddenly received a notification on the company tablet clipped beside the galley entrance. He glanced at the screen, frowned briefly, then locked it before anyone else could see the message. Nicole noticed the change in his expression. "What is it?" she whispered. Daniel shook his head. "Probably operations asking why boarding is delayed." Yet his voice lacked the confidence it carried only moments earlier. Another alert arrived less than 30 seconds later. This time the tablet produced a soft notification tone that echoed clearly enough for the nearest passengers to hear. Daniel looked down again. His posture stiffened almost immediately. Across the aisle, Naomi watched quietly without moving a single inch. She already knew what the notification contained. Hundreds of miles away, inside the airline's corporate operations center, multiple departments had begun reviewing live boarding records, seating history, gate communications, and digital activity logs connected to Flight 281. Every interaction was now being preserved exactly as it occurred. Every employee identification number attached to the flight had entered a monitored review. None of that required Naomi to raise her voice. None of it required an argument. It only required one verified request. Nicole stepped closer to Daniel. "Tell me what is happening." He answered carefully. "Corporate operations has requested that boarding remain open until further notice." Richard Collins frowned immediately. "Further notice? We are ready to leave." Daniel attempted to reassure him. "I am sure this will only take a moment." At that exact instant, the cockpit door opened. Captain Stephen Reynolds stepped into the first-class cabin, carrying his headset in one hand. His expression was calm, but unusually serious. He walked directly toward Daniel instead of greeting the passengers. The two men exchanged only a few quiet words before the captain slowly turned his attention toward Naomi Brooks. He studied her for a brief moment, then looked back at Daniel with an expression that neither Nicole nor Richard had ever seen before. It was the unmistakable look of someone who had just realized the situation inside the cabin was far more significant than anyone had imagined. Captain Stephen Reynolds walked forward with measured steps, stopping beside Daniel Foster instead of immediately addressing the passengers. The quiet confidence that normally filled his presence had been replaced by careful restraint. Daniel lowered his voice. "Captain, we are handling a seating disagreement." The captain did not answer right away. His eyes moved briefly toward Naomi Brooks before returning to Daniel. "Corporate operations asked me a very specific question," he said quietly. "They wanted to know why passenger Naomi Brooks was removed from her assigned first-class seat without a documented authorization code." Daniel's expression tightened. It was an operational decision. The captain asked only one question. "Where is the authorization?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no answer came. Nicole Harrison stepped forward, determined to recover control. "Captain, we were accommodating an important guest." Before she could continue, the cockpit communication handset attached to the forward wall produced a clear, incoming tone. Every conversation inside the cabin stopped. Captain Reynolds answered immediately. Captain Reynolds speaking. The voice on the other end was calm, direct, and impossible to mistake for routine dispatch. "Captain, this is executive operations. Please place your handset on speaker." The captain pressed one button. A composed female voice filled the front of the cabin. "Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Morgan, Executive Director of Corporate Flight Operations. This communication is being recorded for compliance review. Before this aircraft departs, we require immediate confirmation of one passenger." Every member of the crew stood perfectly still. Rachel continued. "Please confirm that Ms. Naomi Brooks is currently seated in her assigned location, Seat 2A. The captain looked directly toward Naomi. "Yes, she is." Rachel answered without hesitation. "Thank you, Captain. For the record, Ms. Naomi Brooks is the chairwoman of the board and the largest individual shareholder of the parent company that owns this airline. She is traveling under executive observation protocol authorized by corporate governance. Her reservation, boarding credentials, and assigned seat are fully valid and have never been modified." The silence that followed seemed to drain every sound from the cabin. Richard Collins slowly lowered his briefcase to the floor. Nicole stared at Naomi as though she were seeing her for the first time. Daniel's shoulders sank almost imperceptibly. Rachel continued speaking with the same professional tone. "Corporate monitoring has documented every interaction since boarding began. We have confirmed there was no authorized seat reassignment, no operational necessity, and no system instruction permitting removal of Ms. Brooks from Seat 2A. Olivia Bennett closed her eyes for one brief moment. The records she had seen were exactly right. Emily Carter quietly looked toward Marcus Hill, who simply nodded without saying a word. Rachel's voice returned one final time. "Captain Reynolds, Executive Review Team requests that the aircraft remain at the gate until the preliminary compliance assessment is complete. Please ensure that all crew members remain available for documentation." "Understood," the captain replied. The connection ended, but nobody moved. Naomi remained seated exactly as she had been since boarding began. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply looked toward Daniel and Nicole with quiet composure. After several long seconds, she finally spoke. "The problem was never that you did not know who I was." Her voice remained steady enough for everyone nearby to hear. "The problem is how easily you decided someone who looked like me did not belong here." No one interrupted her. Richard lowered his eyes. Nicole's confidence disappeared completely. Daniel could not meet Naomi's gaze. The first-class cabin, once filled with assumptions and certainty, now sat in complete silence as every passenger understood that the real revelation was not Naomi's position. It was how differently she had been treated before anyone believed she possessed it. No one spoke for several long seconds after the announcement ended. The silence inside the first-class cabin carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Captain Stephen Reynolds slowly lowered the communication handset and looked at Daniel Foster with an expression that made it clear this situation had moved far beyond an ordinary customer complaint. A new notification appeared on the captain's company tablet almost immediately. He opened it, scanned the contents, and quietly exhaled before addressing his crew. "Corporate compliance has instructed us to preserve every boarding record exactly as it exists. No files are to be modified. No reports are to be edited. Every communication from the gate until this moment has been archived. Daniel's face lost what little confidence remained. Nicole Harrison looked toward Richard Collins as though expecting him to say something that might somehow reverse what had just happened. He did not. He stood silently beside the aisle, avoiding every pair of eyes around him. Another message arrived. This time the captain read it aloud exactly as written. Effective immediately, lead purser Daniel Foster and flight attendant Nicole Harrison are relieved of all passenger service responsibilities pending a formal compliance investigation following arrival. Junior flight attendant Olivia Bennett will assume passenger care responsibilities for the remainder of boarding under direct supervision of the captain. Olivia blinked in disbelief. She had expected questions. She had never expected responsibility. Captain Reynolds looked toward her with calm professionalism. Ms. Bennett, please continue according to company standards. Olivia nodded once. Yes, Captain. She walked toward Naomi with quiet respect. Ms. Brooks, I would like to apologize for what you experienced. Your seat has always been yours, and I will personally ensure that everything you need for this flight is available. Naomi offered a gentle smile. Thank you. I appreciate your professionalism. Across the aisle, Emily Carter quietly began clapping. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply an acknowledgement that someone had chosen integrity when it mattered. Marcus Hill joined her a moment later. Soon several other passengers added their applause, not for Naomi's position or title, but for the simple restoration of fairness. Richard Collins shifted awkwardly before finally speaking. I did not ask anyone to remove her. Naomi turned toward him calmly. Perhaps not. But when unfair treatment benefits us, silence becomes part of the decision. Richard lowered his head without another word. Captain Reynolds received one final communication from Executive Operations. He read it carefully before looking toward Daniel and Nicole. Corporate Review has also confirmed that no passenger preference, loyalty status, or executive request may override a confirmed seat assignment without documented authorization. This reminder will be distributed company-wide following today's review. Daniel quietly removed the identification badge clipped to his jacket and handed it to the captain without argument. Nicole did the same, her earlier certainty completely replaced by quiet reflection. Nobody celebrated their embarrassment. Nobody mocked them. The lesson unfolding inside the cabin no longer belonged to one flight. It belonged to every decision shaped by assumptions instead of facts. Olivia reopened the electronic seating manifest one final time. Seat 2A still displayed exactly what it had displayed from the beginning. Naomi Brooks. Confirmed. She smiled softly, almost to herself, realizing the system had never failed. People had. Naomi looked out the window as ground crews finished, preparing the aircraft for departure. Beyond the glass, baggage carts moved steadily across the ramp exactly as they had before any of this began. The airport had never paused. Only the people inside this cabin had been given an opportunity to decide what kind of airline they truly wanted to represent. And for the first time since boarding began, every answer was finally written in the open for everyone to see. The cabin door finally closed with a quiet click that sounded almost symbolic. Outside, the last service vehicle pulled away from the aircraft, and the afternoon sun reflected across the runway as though nothing unusual had happened. Inside, however, everyone understood they had witnessed something far greater than a disagreement over a seat. They had watched assumptions collide with truth. Captain Stephen Reynolds picked up the intercom once more, his voice steady and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We appreciate your cooperation during an unexpected operational review. We will now prepare for departure. There was no mention of names. No public embarrassment. Only dignity. Olivia Bennett completed her final safety checks before returning to Naomi Brooks with a glass of water. Thank you for your patience, Ms. Brooks, she said quietly. Naomi accepted it with a warm smile. Thank you for choosing integrity when it mattered. Olivia nodded, realizing those words would stay with her far longer than any performance review ever could. Emily Carter looked across the aisle and smiled. I hope more companies have leaders like you. Marcus Hill added softly, real leadership is calm. That is what people forget. Naomi looked at both of them with genuine appreciation. Real leadership begins long before anyone knows who you are. The title only reveals whether you practiced it. Richard Collins remained silent for several moments before finally walking toward Naomi. His confidence had been replaced by quiet humility. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I should have asked questions instead of accepting special treatment." Naomi met his eyes. The strongest people are not the ones who never make mistakes. They are the ones willing to recognize them. Richard gave a slow nod before returning to his assigned seat, this time without complaint. As the aircraft began pushing back from the gate, Naomi looked out the window, watching the terminal slowly drift away. She remembered the young woman standing in that airport years ago, holding a valid first-class ticket while strangers questioned whether she belonged. She remembered promising herself that if she ever gained the ability to influence a system, she would use that influence to strengthen fairness instead of protecting privilege. That promise had guided every decision she made since then. A quiet notification appeared on her phone. It was a brief message from Executive Operations. Initial review completed. Full policy update recommended. Employee recognition submitted for Olivia Bennett. Naomi smiled softly before locking the screen. The outcome she cared about most had never been punishment. It was improvement. Around the cabin, conversations slowly returned. Passengers began discussing vacations, business meetings, and family visits as though life had resumed its ordinary rhythm. Yet something had changed beneath the surface. Emily would remember the importance of speaking when something felt wrong. Marcus would remember that courage sometimes sounded like a calm voice asking simple questions. Olivia would remember that policies only matter when people are willing to honor them. Even Captain Reynolds would carry this flight into future training sessions, reminding crews that professionalism begins with equal respect. As the aircraft lifted into the sky above the runway, Naomi rested comfortably in the seat that had belonged to her from the very beginning. She never raised her voice. She never demanded recognition. She never needed to announce her position to prove her worth. The truth arrived on its own, exactly when it was needed. Looking out across the clouds stretching toward the horizon, she quietly reflected on the lesson that every person in the cabin had shared that afternoon. Respect should never be reserved for the people you recognize. It should be given to every person before you know their name. Because the strongest measure of character is not how you treat someone important. It is how you treat the person